Today we're going to be talking about inflation, all right? And a lot of people don't understand inflation. It can get really complicated. Some people make it, I think, more complicated than what it should be. But let's just take a look at what your lesson. 3 things here that we want to cover about inflation is the difference between what's called monetary inflation and price inflation, how government intervention makes prices rise, and the harmful effects of price inflation. Now, inflation has almost always referred to the rise of the money supply. As the overall money supply has risen, the amount of money that's available out in the world, often called M1, that's a term used to describe readily available money like cash, checking accounts, savings accounts, not CDs, money that gets locked away for investment and that kind of thing, but just readily available money. So when that increases, then inflation increases. And that's what we're talking, that's monetary inflation. So your book talks about the difference between the two. There's a really interesting quote here. It says, the word inflation originally applied solely to the quantity of money. It meant that the volume of money, get this, the volume of money was inflated, blown up, overextended. It is not mere pedantry. In other words, there's nothing wrong with insisting that this word should only be used in the original meaning. But today, to use it to mean a rise in prices deflects attention away from the real cause of inflation and the real cure for it. See, a lot of times when people talk about inflation, they talk about prices going up. But prices go up because the quantity of money, and in your book it's called the stock of money, and again that's that M1 money that's available, as the amount of that money enters into the market, then prices go up. And there's not a strict, if you could imagine a line, as the quantity of money goes up, inflation follows it, okay? And sometimes they're relatively close to each other. At other times, the inflation will go up. I mean, the stock of money, the money supply will go up, and then inflation will a little bit later follow. All right. So that's and there's a thing called the Consumer Price Index that a lot of economists use today, where they take a basket of goods, just typical things that people buy, food, gas, clothing, and they compare the price of those goods, what they were maybe a year ago compared to this same time 1 year later. And if they're higher, then they say inflation has gone up. But as that quote says, prices going up is misleading. And I have shared with my classes that rising prices are the symptom of the cause. And the cause is inflated money, too much money, and so on. Now, why would that happen? Your book talks a little bit about the history in the Roman government. Way back in Rome, when they did something what they called, they debased the money. They would take gold and collect it from people for taxes. And then they would take the gold and they would melt it down and remint it. Okay, in other words, make new coins out. But when the new coins were made, they would add a little bit so it wasn't all gold. So now prices would cost almost twice as much because it's not all gold. It takes more. And once people found out about it, they would raise their prices. And so that happened very early on. And that's what governments like to do. If governments can get their hand on and control the money supply, then that's what they can do. They can take the money and they can debase it. That means they can lower the value. They can lower the value of the money. And so that's ultimately brought into what's called today fiat currency or fiat money. Fiat money, it means by fiat, by decree of the government. So our founding fathers never wanted a central bank. That was very clear from the Constitution. They never really wanted a central bank, but over time they gave in through a lot of bank failures and issues and problems and so on that people were having. And so to try to control and stabilize, an agency called the Federal Reserve, often called the Fed, was created in 1913. And the Fed, one of the responsibilities of the Fed is to manage the supply of money, whether it's increasing it or decreasing it. And another thing that's happened is people would use papered bills. For a long time, people would use paper bills with gold backed behind it. So the idea was the money, the true money, was the gold that was kept in bank vaults. But because it's not easy to lug around a bunch of gold, it's easier to carry around pieces of paper. The dollar bills, our dollars, were just simply certificates, okay? Currency, certificates. But the real money was the gold that backed that. So basically, if I bought something from you for $10, I would give you a $10 bill, a certificate, okay? And basically that transfers the ownership of the gold from me to you for that value of $10 worth of gold. So that was how we operated for a very long time. For a long time, from the late 1800s till about 1933 or 1934, everybody understood that an ounce of gold was worth $20.67. And so, but as I said, it was cumbersome to carry around gold, and so they did the dollar bills, paper certificates. Now, I believe it was President Roosevelt in about 1935 that took us off the gold standard, took the United States off the gold standard, meaning that citizens could no longer really own gold, and they would just pass dollars back and forth, and fiat currency by decree of the government. So there's nothing of value really backing up those dollars anymore, other than the government says, here's a dollar. And so if you went to the bank and you gave them $20, it used to be you could expect to get $20 worth of gold back. Now, if you go to the bank, you give them $20, they give you, 2 10s or 4 5s or a 10 and 2 5s or whatever. But no longer were you going to get gold or silver. And then in 1971, when I was in high school, President Nixon finalized this by, up to that point, we were transferring gold for dollars back and forth with other countries. And President Nixon fixed the price of gold in 1971, or the price of the dollar, off the gold standard. It took him off the gold standard, and so now everybody was on this fiat currency. And so that's the danger, and the danger of that is the Federal Reserve now manages the money supply in that way. There's nothing of value to hold things down. So one of the things the Federal Reserve will do is they'll raise interest rates, and if they raise interest rates, that discourages borrowing, and the money supply is what we call retracted. Okay, it's taken back in. If the Federal Reserve lowers interest rates, it wants to encourage people spending. So low interest rates means people will borrow, businesses will borrow for investment, people will borrow to buy things and so on and so forth, maybe houses, and that puts money out there. All right, that back and forth movement of the money supply. And so if the money supply is lower, then the inflation might drop, but when that money supply goes back out, it creates inflation. So inflation is really created in one place only, and that is in Washington, D.C. these days, because the Federal Reserve has that ability to print money and to create inflation. In fact, that's why today a dollar, things that cost $1 in 1913 cost $22 today. We've lost about 95% of the value. So we don't have what's called a sound money anymore. We've got money and that have values that can jump all over the place, and interest rates will be up and down, and inflation can be up and down. And there again, The deception is inflation is not prices are rising. Inflation is a sign that the dollar is devalued and it's not worth nearly what it was. And like I said to you just a few minutes ago, our dollars today are about 95% less, okay, 95% less what they were worth in 1913. That's the big picture of the book here, talking about introducing you to inflation and the real cause of inflation and a little bit of why it happens. Today with fiat currencies all over the world, there's exchange rates that are back and forth. Some people will still peg, that is, attach their, like Canada might attach its, have an exchange rate with our dollar. And so, or Mexico with their peso might have an exchange rate with our dollar, but there's no longer a fixed exchange rate. Your book didn't really talk about those terms. There's no longer what we call a fixed exchange rate, $20.67 for an ounce of gold. Not that anymore. Today the exchange rates float because there's nothing of value behind these currencies. All right, it's all based upon supply and demand. So if you understand the laws of supply and demand, then you'll understand that somewhat. That's the big picture. We'll talk more